Hello and welcome to the Gooner Talk, back again with you guys for another show, for another episode of our TGT podcast, our weekly show after our weekend match, which was a Friday this week, which basically means you got two schools of thought, which is either Arsenal ruins your entire weekend or it makes it blissful, and then you remember the team that you support and you prepare yourself for a weekend of misery that can be saved only by my namesake, not namesake, but lookalike necessarily. I am the fat Emerick Laporte, supposedly, and I mean, he turned up for the books today with a fantastic goal for City, and it made our weekend all the sweeter. I'm joined by two fantastic guests, hopefully soon to be three, but I mean, you know what Wayne's like, so fingers crossed the Irishman turns up at some stage. First off, we're joined by the man that's been trapped in his basement for the last month or so. He claims that it's because they're redecorating, but actually it's because he hosted his own house Kroenke out protest, and the other half has effectively just kicked him out. How you doing, Jared? Are you well?
Hey, doing pretty good. Thanks for having me back. And you're not too far off on the better half, shoving me in the basement. That's pretty accurate.
Deary me. I wish you the best of luck, mate, but yeah, it might take you a while before you get back out again. And then I can't think of an intro for Drew. I literally spent about a good 10 minutes thinking, what can I say about Drew that won't hurt his feelings? And the answer is nothing, because he's a sensitive little flower. So, Drew, welcome, mates. How are you?
I think you just found the intro. Here and now. I'm good. How are you? I'm good.
I'm very good, mate. I'm very, very good. Considering, of course, the weekend that we just experienced. Let's kick off talking about that. There was obviously the weekend started a little bit early for a lot of people. The game was kind of a secondary fixture, and the Kroenke protest took real precedence. We are going to talk about Kroenke and the ownership and the issues that surrounded that, but we are going to start the podcast, of course, talking about the game itself. There were some issues, it's fair to say, with the lineup, more so through force. Others would say that wrong decisions were made. And for a player that seemingly was out the door just a fair few weeks ago, Eddie Nketiah has somehow just wangled his way back into the starting 11. I know he did score against Fulham, and of course we've got some injuries, but a lot of people were hoping for Martinelli or someone else, or even Balogun, to maybe even step up. But Drew, I saw a tweet that you put out ahead of the game, which got a lot of attention, a lot of stick and support. In fairness, it was both kind of half and half. And you said effectively, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were surprised at the surprise of how many people were surprised by, I'm going to say surprise one more time, the amount of people that were kind of taken aback by the fact that a natural striker was playing instead of what has predominantly been a wide player for us in Martinelli.
I mean, I don't know how you want me to follow up with that, but you've kind of just summed it up. No, I don't think we're at that part of the Arteta project where we can just have, wide players becoming false nines on a whim. Like, this isn't Bernardo Silva at City who can just slide in or Phil Foden. Like, we're not at that level yet. I just think maybe Arteta wanted some continuity in terms of who's playing where. I just think the overall angst was, I think, just fans just want Martinelli starting, and that's okay, obviously. And I support that too. I think he should be getting more minutes than he has been. But I don't think that's going to help anybody by, slotting him into a center forward role. Or I don't think he's ideally suited to yet. I don't think we really have the system in place, or maybe even arguably the players around him are available for that to really come off quite well. It's not to say that I think Nketiah is the answer either. We've talked a lot in the WhatsApp group over the last couple of years, and did jokes from Mike about it, obviously, but I just don't think Nketiah is of the grade that we really need, even for a second or third choice striker. So. But I do think it's just based off of he's a center forward, so he's going to play a center forward in the center forward channel. I think that's kind of where it is. And to be fair, Martinelli coming off the bench and getting 17, 18 minutes in that role doesn't also mean that he should be starting in that role. So two different things, coming off the bench in 18 minutes when you have energy, when you need to press more. If maybe you switch tactics just a little bit and you want maybe a bit more fluidity than having just a real focus in the attacks, it's a bit different. So, I just kind of feel like at this point, I think there's so much angst. And this is where I kind of understand. I think there's so much angst in the fan base that anything that happens that fans don't agree with, it's going to be met with maybe more backlash than it would if circumstances were normal. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like if we just won 5 in a row, and we had an outside shot Champions League, and you think maybe Martinelli didn't start because he might be starting midweek against Villarreal. You never really know. So maybe there's a different scope and lens that fans look at things through. But I just think things are so bad in terms of patience that I feel like anything could probably come under an increased microscope that may or may not be warranted.
Let's have a look at what you guys said in the chat box, because I did ask of what kind of who you wanted to see starting at striker. I mean, Indesud says Leno should have been up front. We'll come on to him a little bit later, but I think there's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek related to that. UTA says no-brainer. It should have been Martinelli. Jashar says, agreeing with Drew there, that Nketiah was probably the more natural choice. We'll answer some of these other questions a little bit later. And if you do have questions, of course, we will be doing our questions section as normal at the last half an hour of the show. Yonic Mac wanted to see Balogun being brought in. Matthew says, I didn't expect Martinelli to start, especially up front, so I was fine with Nketiah. Danny from the Burkout Wonderland says, Eddie has shown he can only be prolific against young men / teenagers. Sadly, he will probably never be good enough. JD Davidson says Balogun because of all the non-stop hype, just to put it in perspective of the Premier League, which actually makes a lot of sense because he has received a lot of hype from a lot of Arsenal fans, when ironically his youth record's not even stacked up against Nketiah's youth record. He's come onto the Europa League scene, scored against Mulder and Dundalk. He hasn't yet proven himself against a bigger side. Arguably, he's not really been given the opportunity to, which is also a big thing that goes alongside that. But I think there is an element of maybe tempering expectations of this season, and maybe the last few Premier League games when there's not really anything to play for us anyway. We'll see him come into those games maybe as a substitute. Another decision, which I suppose with the benefit of hindsight, Jared, is a lot easier to say was the wrong choice. But he was the man that you picked in your preview show in goal, and that was Bernd Leno. A lot of people wanted to see Matty Ryan continue in goal after how he did against Fulham, and he only conceded a penalty in that game, and I thought his distribution was really good too. But he went with Leno, and obviously we know what happened. Are you regretting that, or do you still think it was the right choice overall? I know with hindsight it's very easy for me to say that, but go for it, mate.
Yeah, I guess the only reason that I would have thought about Ryan in this game is if for some reason Leno needed a rest, which I don't see being the case. I don't think Leno's a world-class goalkeeper. I don't think anybody thinks that of him. But of the two, I think objectively, when you look at their whole careers, Leno is a better keeper than Ryan, so I would leave him in. I mean, obviously, he had an absolute howler, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens on Thursday. I think that's going to be the really interesting thing that comes out of it, because now, even more so than last week, we're going to see a lot of people pushing for Ryan to start. I'm kind of reluctantly still in the camp I would go with Leno that game. I certainly understand why we may not. It was a horrific goal he gave up that obviously cost us 3 points, 2 points, however you want to look at it. But I do still think he's the better keeper. And like Drew said, when things aren't going well, every single thing is going to get critiqued to a much higher degree, and especially with our fan base where everybody's so reactionary to everything. I look at it as if we pull Leno out, what's the road for him getting back in look like? Certainly if Ryan goes out there and lets 3 past, for one, Leno will get his spot back. But we're around the Arsenal community enough and online community to know if Ryan starts on Thursday and gives up 3 goals, the instant reaction is going to be, this is the fault of Mikel Arteta. He made a knee-jerk reaction to 1 bad goal given up, made the wrong decision, played not as good of a player, and cost us our season potentially out of Europa League, out of Europe altogether. So there's kind of a lot going into that one small decision. But if it was up to me, even despite the performance Friday, I would still go with Leno, just because I think in general he's a better overall keeper than Ryan.
Fair enough. A fair play for sticking to your guns, fella. I'm of the other opinion. I feel like in the most important game of our season, with the kind of mental low that Leno has hit, I would rather maybe see him given a little bit of a kind of escape from the spotlight, not necessarily as a punishment, but more so for the protection of his sanity in a way. But I completely get the other perspective of it. Drew, I'm really intrigued to know where you sit, because you've had your reservations about Leno from the point of which he signed, of course, as I can see from your facial expression. So what do you feel about the choice? And obviously, how did you feel about his performance against Everton as well?
I mean, Danny kind of put it best. You know, Danny has a habit of doing that. He made a really good reaction save in the
Once
first
in a
half.
blue moon.
he had a really good reaction save in the first half, and then, you know, the howler, and more often than not, you know, 8 or 9 times out of 10, you know, Leno has a pretty good day. But again, I think there are a lot of fans who do think Leno was world class, and that's when I get angry about it. He's not, and the same kind of big blunders you'll see from him with us, you saw at Leverkusen for the majority of his time there. You know, he benefited from a system that really suited him. You know, defensively they were quite strong when he was there. These are all good things, obviously, but it's the reason why he hasn't overtaken Manuel Neuer, even when Manuel Neuer was at his lowest point for the last couple of years, maybe before the season. Everyone was saying, well, Neuer's got to go, Neuer's got to go, Neuer's got to go. And Leno didn't take the chance. You know, Ter Stegen didn't do it either, obviously, but he's barely usurped Ter Stegen. So I just kind of feel like I think fans have a kind of a tainted idea of what goalkeeping is. It's not just about shot stopping. And let's be clear, I think Bernd is probably the best pure shot stopper in the Premier League. I would honestly say that. I think Michael, your Marcel is a good one to agree with that. He has a lot of experience goalkeeping. He has sons that are keepers, so he understands maybe that more even than I do, because I wasn't a goalkeeper. I don't train goalkeepers, so I don't know. But I would say just purely off that aspect alone, you would rate Leno. But there's so many other intangibles to Leno's game that show you why maybe that goal against Everton happened. So the fact that mistakes have happened before, so it's just inexplicable lapse of judgment just out of nowhere, you know. Doesn't command the box well, isn't great on set piece. Like, these are all things that people have been talking about since he was in Bundesliga still. So for me, my only gripe is the fact that there hasn't been enough marked improvement in his game since we purchased him. And I think that's why, when I remember you and I spoke about the other day, that's why I think you're from the camp of you thought that we should have kept Martinez. You know, I think there's scope to make the argument. And I'm not trying to get into this debate because I just don't have the patience. But if you look at the overall game, you could probably say that maybe Martinez is a little bit better, or just maybe more suited to the Premier League. It's something that I said when we were first linked to Leno, before we bought him. I said his game could struggle in Premier League because just the aerial presence that you need in the Premier League was a lot more than in Bundesliga. You know, not a lot of teams lump balls into the box. Not a lot of teams rely on headed goals to the same fashion. The physical aspect of it, the fact that, you know, there's just so many tactical things that you can compare the two leagues to say that a keeper like Leno would struggle less in Bundesliga than he would in the Premier League. I think a lot of those things have cropped up since he's moved here. And let's be clear, I don't think he's been poor. I don't think he was bad against Everton, but it's just, to me, it's just frustrating that he still keeps making those saves. Every now and then he makes those bonehead errors. And I think what frustrates me is I think he gets more of a pass than someone like, I hate to do this to myself, but someone like Xhaka, who, when he makes the odd mistake, it's like people want to string him up by his toenails, you know, and give him the Mussolini treatment. But if Leno makes a bonehead error, which directly cost us, you know, at least a point, you know, when we weren't very good, I think some people try to wiggle their way out of giving criticism just because overall, whether they like his personality or they like him as a player, or overall because he has been fared relatively good since we bought him. That frustrates me. I don't think he should be dropped necessarily. I think if you keep doing this with your keepers, you need your keepers to be consistent, I feel like. And I think United got lucky in terms of De Gea when they switched to Henderson. I think they were lucky that Henderson came on and did as well as he has. You know, really kind of took his chance, similar to Martinez, but, you know, with different circumstances. But I think Leno should keep his place because it's a European fixture. Things will be a little bit different against Villarreal, you would imagine. So maybe the best of his game will show in that regard. But I think if he has a howler against Villarreal, then you could say maybe you give Ryan the rest of the Premier League and maybe you keep Leno for Europa League or vice versa. I don't really quite know.
Well, I was going to say, surely you'd go vice versa because Premier League's done.
Yeah, exactly. Whichever it is, you know, however you want to spin it, I do think that Leno has to bounce back, and I think Arteta made that clear. in his post-match. He said he has to get him to understand that mistakes happen. You move on from there. If Leno moves on and he has an absolute brilliant performance, then that answers your question, right? But yeah, I mean, I get the frustration behind it as well. I mean, but I wasn't necessarily surprised, but it's kind of just like, of course, of course it happened, because why wouldn't it? So
yeah. You brought up Martinez, which, I mean, they're losing currently 2-1. I don't know if Martinez has been at fault for either of those 2 goals, because I haven't seen them, which ironically helps us in the battle for 9th place in the table. So that's still odd. But when it comes down to kind of that argument, I don't like talking about things obviously we have no control over, and it's a lot of context to it. But you do have to come to a period where you say, look, for me, is it 2-2? It's 2-2 now. So they equalised in the last few minutes. So they will still remain 1 point behind. It doesn't change too much, but yeah, they remain 1 point behind us with a game in hand. So it's probably the time, Jared, where you turn around and you go, we probably made a mistake.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are saying that. And
are you saying that?
I would say of the 2 right now, who do I think is a better Premier League keeper going forward? I would probably lean Martinez. I actually took a lot of flack on a different podcast quite a while back, and Drew saying something about it kind of made me think of it. I made the statement that I'm not saying Leno is a world-class goalkeeper, but I think he is a world-class shot stopper. He makes a lot of incredible saves, big aerial saves, but he is a little more deficient than Martinez in a lot of those other areas. So in general, I like a keeper who's bigger in stature, who's strong in the air. And just when you watch the game, you feel like Martinez has more a command of his area than Bernd Leno does. Now, whether that matters to you, I don't know. But when I watch the game, that's what I take out of it. I feel more confident when a cross is coming in or a corner is coming in. I will feel much more confident with Martinez there than I do Leno. Now, I think it's by small margins. I don't think this is a case where one guy is dramatically better than the other. I don't think either one any of us would call a world-class goalkeeper. I think they're both of a Premier League level. It's just kind of the fine margins of what you're looking for in a keeper. But having the hindsight we have now, I would certainly take Martinez based on what he's done this year over what we've gotten out of Leno this year on our end.
I think that it's obviously with the guy that Leno is and the season that Martinez has had. And funnily, I saw someone tweet saying, like, if you take away the mistake against who was it who played Everton, and you take away the mistake in the other game, I can't remember what game it was. I think it was Liverpool, when he just like his wrists just melted effectively. He's actually had a decent season overall, and actually he's pulled off some decent saves. It's his distribution, it's his consistency, and it is those errors. Jared, I feel like you want to jump in.
Yeah, and I think the distribution is a big part of why people prefer Martinez. But I think there's a little bit of recency bias to all this, probably myself included. When we look at last season, as well as Martinez played, before he came in, I think arguably prior to the injury, Bernd Leno was on pace to maybe be our player of the season last year. So he hasn't had a history of performing poorly for a long time. But based kind of just on this season, I understand why a lot of people would prefer Martinez would have stayed and Leno would have gone.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Martinez is for me the better keeper. He's got the highest save percentage in the Premier League right now. So even as we talk about there as Leno kind of as a better shot stopper maybe, but this season Martinez has been incredible in goal for Villa, and I don't even think that's down to, like, in previous seasons you might have been able to say, well, that's because Villa faced more shots. Well, Arsenal faced a hell of an amount of shots this season from opposition, so I don't think that even comes into it right now. So it will look like a mistake. It's one that we can't dwell on. It's one that I'm not going to dwell on because we can't go back and change it now. So I understand why it happened and why we did it, but it is looking like a very big error on kind of the recruiting and selling side of things at the club. In other areas of the pitch, there's an area I want to focus on, Drew, and this is Xhaka playing at left back. Now, against Sheffield United, Xhaka looked good in the game. Against Slavia Prague, I thought he looked quite good in that game. Against Fulham, there were things that were starting to unravel, and then it seemingly unraveled quite a bit against Everton and Richarlison in particular on that right-hand side. Is it time for you to play either play a more naturally left-footed and player that can play there in Saka and move Xhaka back into the midfield over a Danny Ceballos, or a Cedric coming into that position as another alternative? Or are you still still inclined to say that he's the best man for the job there right now?
I've never said he was the best man for the job, so we can kind of just put that out there immediately.
In anything, or just a left back?
No, just a left back. And I like a lot of what Xhaka brings, but certainly it's not a left back. And I think this is kind of where a lot of people will criticize Arteta. It's that match-to-match management of saying, you could look good against a Sheffield United. It's not hard to defend and look good against Sheffield United who only play one brand of football. But when you play a team like Everton, like Fulham, who, for all their issues this season, they do have some players with pace that can kill you if you're not careful. And I do think maybe Xhaka played pretty all right against Slavia. I think a lot has to do with maybe Sima not being there. I'm not quite sure, but I think kind of for me, that's where you have to make the change. Yeah, I mean, it's not ideal that Cedric isn't predominantly left-footed. Yeah, it's not ideal if you move Saka back there, because you're taking away so much that he gives us moving forward, although you could just say you could operate in the same way you operate Kieran Tierney, so that you don't really change much. But I think having to juggle your 11 to really utilize your players' best attributes is important, instead of just harping on kind of one aspect of it. I mean, yeah, great, Xhaka is left-footed, but I would rather play at Saka there, and then you have Smith Rowe that can play on the left. I'd even be fine with Saka playing there and even just using Willian at left wing. I know that might get lost. I'd rather that than play a midfielder who is a deeper creative player at left back when it's just not suited. That you can maybe argue that in left side of a back three, it's not as bad. You're not as exposed for pace. The principles of playing left center back and the back three are similar to playing as a deeper midfielder, as a defensive midfielder, so it's not that much of a change. When you play left back, and it takes so much away from the way we play. That's what I mean. Like, Cedric might not be predominantly left-footed, but he can still get forward. He can still kind of do similar things to what a traditional left-footed left back can do, whereas Xhaka is just kind of almost operating like he normally would in midfield, just from left back. It's not the same. It doesn't give you the same threat, doesn't give the team the same issue to worry about. And then when they're in possession, when they're trying to break, you can look at Xhaka and say, well, obviously he's a good player, but he can be exposed for pace. So I'm surprised more teams didn't. I'm surprised Everton didn't try to isolate him more than maybe they did moving forward in the match. I figured they would have gone right for his throat from minute one for the entirety of 90 minutes. I don't think they did. So I think we got maybe a bit lucky in that regard. I think this is where I criticize Arteta, and I prefer that he stay. But one of the things that I dislike the most is that decisions like this, it makes more sense. Just forget about the fact that you want someone left foot there for now. Play someone who is more suited to the position overall, and you just sacrifice like there's not going to be a left-footed player there for a few matches. It's really not that big of a deal. If it was like a whole thing, if we were stuck in this position for 6 months, it's a different discussion. You know what I mean? So, yeah, I just kind of feel like moving forward against Villarreal, and to his credit, not a lot of us like Unai Emery, but I kind of feel like he'll target that if he sees Xhaka there midweek. I think Emery is tactically astute enough to focus that as one of our weaknesses, and he might want to exploit it. And however way he plans to do that, I don't know, but it's something we need to be cognizant of. So I just think Arteta needs to make some little tweaks a little bit better than he has been this season.
Yeah, I'm just checking out kind of how Villarreal are getting on this weekend, because they played they played Barcelona and lost, but it wasn't exactly it wasn't like a run-of-the-mill win for Barcelona. They won 2-1 at Villarreal. They went 1-0 down to a Samuel Chukwueze goal, which in itself is a talking point, because he's the guy that's going to be up against whoever our left back is. Loves to cut inside on that left foot and strike the ball. And I don't want to see Granit Xhaka up against him, because if he gets turned, he's never catching it. And if he is, he's going to take him out. And it's going to be an absolute bloodbath. So I don't want to see that happening. They've been weird of late. I mean, they lost against Alaves. They put a decent display in against Barca today, and of course they've had some really decent results this season too, especially in the Europa League, where I think they are pretty much unbeaten at this point throughout the competition. So it's they're a very, very good side. not as good as the Villarreals we played in the past, but they're still a very, very good side under a manager that knows us inside out. Let's see what you guys are saying in the chat box in regards to who you would play at left back. Victor says Saka. Kevin says Saka. Joel's says Saka as well. JD says Cedric, we need Saka up top. Sasuga would not put Xhaka in the squad at all, which I think is slightly harsh. Gary Hardy says Saka. Let's go. The guy says anyone but Bellerin, which is fair enough. And I also saw a shout for a 3 at the back system with Saka as a left wing back, which I also think is an option that we can use. I think that Chambers gives us the ability to play him as kind of a right-sided centre-back in a back 3 with then Marian holding in that back line, or you could even go with both left-footers if you wanted to. And that's the only way I feel that you could put those two together. But they have never played together, Marie and Gabriel, which would be a little bit of a problem, I feel, going into this one. But we've got lots of kind of decisions to make, that is for sure. Let's move on to talking about kind of the big VAR situation we faced, which Jared... I mean, I put a picture out on social media of the call that they showed on the screens, and I mean, I couldn't make sense of it. I then went to Dale Johnson, who's a journalist at ESPN, who breaks down on Twitter all of the VAR calls every single weekend, and he effectively said that a different VAR, so a different video assistant refereeing official, would give that the other way, and he would place the lines in a different place because human error and the way that they're placed means that there is, when they're that tight, it's basically just at the discretion of wherever the line is placed by the official. What do you feel about that whole situation? I mean, arguably for some people it wasn't a penalty anyway, but the penalty was given, and then it was the VAR's offside that ruled it out. So what did you make of that whole fiasco?
VAR's been a disaster from beginning to end this year. The one thing I'll say about it, it's been consistently inconsistent. My issue isn't necessarily with one call or another. It's that you'll have a virtually identical situation on the same match day in 2 different games. It goes to VAR and we get it called the opposite direction. And I think that's everybody else's issue with it too, is just the vast inconsistency. And then when some decisions, I think, go for one of the larger teams that kind of everybody's got their tinfoil hat on, that VAR's in place to help these teams and hurt other teams and all that. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I haven't seen enough to make me think that is, but I understand why people hate it. The Pepe penalty, the words that were, every time you hear VAR, you hear the term clear and obvious. Nothing about this is clear and obvious. If you have to put 1 millimeter lines on the screen, look at it in HD from 10 different angles, there's nothing clear and obvious there. If it was called onside, it should be onside. And as far as these lines that are touching each other, I think it's just against the spirit of the game. The rule's in place, so an offensive player isn't gaining an advantageous position over the defender by playing beyond them. There's no way you can tell me that that was what happened there when you look at that play with Pepe. They're virtually, the lines are right on top of each other. And on top of that, I don't know, I haven't gone back and counted how many passes were played between when that happened and when the penalty was called. This was, when they talk about phases of play, I think it's a very good argument that this happened further enough back that it shouldn't matter anyway. It really didn't have any impact on the way the play ended. But as a whole, I don't like VAR at all. I don't like the way it's been implemented. I don't like the way these things are kind of adjudicated on the pitch. I'd be very much for, and I know people hate anytime we try and inject anything American into European sport, but I like very much when you watch an NFL football game, when a call is being made, the official has to walk out there, put a microphone on, and sort of explain their decision and why they made it. That doesn't mean you're going to get every call right, but I think it does end some of the fans questioning it and commentators questioning it as far as what the person was thinking at the time. As far as the penalty, it was a soft one. If they called it a penalty, fine. If they didn't, it's not one I would be outraged by. But for me, beyond just the one call on Pepe, VAR's just been horribly inconsistent, and there needs to be some major overhaul of it this summer, I think is fair to say.
Yeah, I think there's a few people in the chat box that are having their say on it, which is great. JD Davidson says VAR is highlighting how bad the referees are in terms of consistency. I don't know if you watched the League Cup final today, and whilst obviously I was very happy that the referee was seemingly taking a very lenient kind of way of looking at Manchester City during the game, but he screwed Spurs over a lot in the game. He was giving really strange decisions. I think it was Tierney. I can't remember his first name. but he was the guy that was the ref, and he effectively just let all of these cynical fouls go, unless it was a case of an absolute outright one. There was one by Diaz on Kane that wasn't even a foul. He got the ball, but it was cynical, and it was worthy of a yellow card had it been a foul in that area. Didn't give the yellow card. It was, I couldn't believe it. Paul Tierney, thank you in the chat. I couldn't believe how lenient he was being towards Man City. I was buzzing for it, don't get me wrong. But yeah, and it has this season really highlighted. I mean, the famous quote of Wenger saying how many English referees will go into the World Cup, like that in itself sums things up about the officiating in the country. And I'm not saying that it's perfect everywhere else. It isn't. I mean, the amount of La Liga I watched, the refereeing in Spain is horrific. It is really, really poor as well. So just in general, officiating needs to improve. And I think, Jared, when you raised the point about being able to hear them, that would bring a level of accountability. Not only would it explain to us why they're making those decisions, but we'd understand that, and then that could be critiqued, and you'd have kind of debates. And you see like Peter Walton in the BT studios, who all that Peter Walton does for me is just try to justify the decision that the referee's made, not necessarily give his own view. And even when he says something prior to a decision being made and it's wrong, and the referee on the pitch gives a different decision, he then goes, "Oh, I can see why he's done that." It's just like, just have an opinion. Like, don't just try and justify it. And that's the problem we've got at the moment. It's because we can't understand and why they're given the decisions that they are. Like, there was another decision. I don't know, Drew, if you remember this in the game, but I think it's Holgate makes a tackle on Pepe, and it studs down onto his ankle. And some people might say that that's not a red card. I don't. Part of me feels like it's in that really kind of grey area between a yellow and a red for me. But then I look at the one for West Ham against Chelsea on Balbuena, if people saw that one, where Balbuena literally clears the ball away, and because of just where his foot's landing, he lands on the back of, I think it's Chilwell's right calf. They give that as dangerous playing and send him off. And it's this inconsistency that I just can't get on board with. I don't know what you made of the tackle from Holgate on Pepe, Drew, but give me your thoughts around the VAR situation.
I mean, I'm a fan of VAR, but I'm not a fan of the idiots running it. And I think that's kind of where most people stand. And with as much Bundesliga as I do watch, there's far less controversy week in, week out with the way VAR is used in Germany, because things are done more so by the letter of the law. I think for me, the refereeing in England is always about the referee's bias and how they interpret what the rules say. And I think for me, that's the problem. If you remove interpretation, if it's just literally strict letter of the law, verbatim, word for word, this is how something is. When you see this, this is how it's ruled. That's it. You know, if you just did it just that way alone, you would take out so many of the issues that we've seen with VAR, personally for me. I am a fan of it. But for me, the contention comes in, and I think Yannick has pointed this out, and I have been saying this since VAR really first came in. I was just saying, football is not made to be played by robots. Getting things to the millimeter perfect is not possible with a human being. It just isn't. Mm-hmm. And the technology doesn't exist really. Well, maybe it does, to measure a human movement to the millimeter for it to be perfect. That's not what football is supposed to be about. So you take an example. If a player is offside and you're starting to draw lines about, and you're measuring half their thumb as offside, and we've seen it at that point, it's to the point of excess. Like that, there's no advantage on my thumb being slightly longer than yours, and I am now. That's the reason why I was carried through. No, like that's ridiculous. It's one thing, if half your body's offside, like traditional offside calls that you would have seen over however many decades of football we can all cut between us. But I think they're measuring it to a standard that's not possible to justify. I think so. Yeah. If you change that aspect of it, and then if you change the aspect of things cannot be interpreted by the refs, again, so we can go back to the Holgate challenge. First of all, the fact that we're discussing whether it's yellow or red is half the problem. There should be a rule that says if it studs into the ankle, it's a red, or it's not. That's it. Do you know what I mean? Like, so just that example, in isolation kind of proves that that's half the problem. You need standardized things that just are irrefutable. This is what it is. This is what it's not. That solves a lot of problems for me. I think for everybody. And whether we agree what the ruling is, you could at least say, well, there's no controversy because we know what the rule is. We don't have to agree with it. But if that's and to be fair, I've gotten studs into the ankle. You've gotten studs into the ankle. That's for me, if I'm a player, that's red.
My glass ankles, yeah.
Yeah, that's the red. When I coach, for me, that's a red. But if I'm a fan, if my player does it and I'm watching Arsenal and Xhaka does it, I might try to find scope to say that wasn't a red and here's why. But it's not my job to try to officiate the match. I do feel like sometimes, because I think, and it's not their fault, but obviously if you ref in the sport, it's because you're a fan of the sport. So you also feel that passion for the sport. Maybe sometimes your inherent biases come in from your experience in that sport. And then you can kind of look at that example, maybe I can't speculate, obviously, but I do feel like that's where some of the bias comes in. Maybe how this referee feels this rule should be, but isn't. So they make a slight different judgment on the pitch at the time based off of their own inherent bias. You know what I mean? So if you just change the rules for it to be cut and dry, that just solves so much for me.
Yeah, and I mean the issue is obviously we've seen inconsistency through making the rules cut and dry because of the whole handball situation at the start of the season, where the handball kind of rule was basically if it hits your arm in the box, it's a ped. And I get what you're saying, Drew, but it's also about how they write them so that situations like that don't happen. And then that they don't change it or they decide to change it during a season, because we've got with the handball situation, we saw with Liverpool against Newcastle, Callum Wilson goes through on goal. It bounces off the keeper and hits his arm. That is in a natural position. It hits him in a split second. He has absolutely no control where his hand is, and his arm is basically into his body anyway. It's not away from his body, which is that whole kind of idea around the rule it goes in. And then they disallow it. And then in the commentary, it tells you how little people know about the rules right now. And even to the point where Peter Walton didn't know, is that they said in commentary that next season they're changing the rule so that won't be allowed. And then after the game, it turned out that goal still would have been disallowed next season because it was scored by the player whose arm it touched, and they're changing it next season so that if it hits the arm of a player, that then that player plays it to someone else and they score, it's fine. But if the person who scored the goal, it touches their arm in that moment and goes in, then it's not a goal. And the explanation behind that was all about the fact that we want to play football, we want a goal to be like a purity and stuff like that. And I couldn't believe what I listened to. So hold on, it's a handball for one person, but it's not a handball for the other person in the exact same example.
But do you see the verbal and mental gymnastics that I'm talking about? That shouldn't be the case. It's way too much. It's like to the point of absurdity. And I think that's where I think every fan base can agree, whether if you've gotten lucky with VAR or not this season or last season or whatever it might be. I think for me, VAR is just one massive gray area, and week to week, depending on the referee you get or whoever is controlling VAR that week, that's gonna be the way the wind blows based off their own personal biases. And I think that for me is the problem. Like I said, if you remove personal bias and you try to hone in as much as you possible, obviously there are circumstances in football that's really hard to write, like an in stone kind of letter of the law, and like a handball, if you take a shot, it deflects off the keeper, it hits my arm, and we're team. I can understand that there might be some discussion about should there be handball on me or not. That's fine, but there's so many other situations where you can look at it and just say it's either this or it's that. And we've heard a lot on commentary in halftime and full time on your feeds and mine about studio commentary about this is nonsense. Like pick something, just pick something and run with it. And it's just I don't know, yeah.
Right, that's kind of the game. We talked about the rubbish goal we conceded. We talked about the VAR chaos. All we haven't really talked about is kind of where this leaves us and Arteta and the situation. Because even though a lot of people have written off the league, the meltdown was still very classic Arsenal on social media, even though the league games for a lot of people don't particularly matter. They matter to me because I'd like to see us build up some momentum going into these games in the Europa League more than anything, rather than actually where we finish at the Premier League. Having these kind of inconsistent runs does not help our stance. That win against Sheffield United set us up really well for the game against Slavia Prague, which we then scored 4 in. So it's really important that we have these. I obviously am still in the same mind that I was and have been, where I feel like I want to see another summer window under this coach before I think about deciding that I want change. I was listening to Andrew Arscast saying that he felt if we don't, based upon how we finished this season, if we don't qualify for the Europa League, then he could see maybe the ownership, based upon the backlash of this week, making more drastic decisions and getting rid of him at the end of this season and being proactive and getting someone else in the next summer window. I don't know if they would do that. I would struggle. I still feel like that he has the full backing of the ownership and things as well. Jared, I can see a nod in your head. Do you think this is going to be the case? Do you think that you're wavering in any way based upon, say if we were to lose the rest of the Premier League games this season, would it change your mind about the coach?
It doesn't change my mind on the situation. I've said going back to, last fall, Arteta is going to be our manager at the start of next season. If we lose the rest of the Premier League games this year, I don't think he's going anywhere. And I thought it was funny this week that a lot of people sort of criticized his, the way he sort of limited the way he talked about the Super League and KSE's involvement in it. If there's one person that doesn't want to see KSE out, it's probably Mikel Arteta, because they seem to love him and his job has been extremely secure. If you bring in new ownership, one of the first things they're going to look at is the executive structure and who's managing the team. And if it's somebody from the outside who comes in, they're going to look at our season overall. And it's hard to say at this point. It's been a resounding success. So I think they would be much more apt to make a move than KSE will be this summer. That said, I'm fine with him going into next season. I think over the last 12 to 18 months, the moves we've made in the various transfer windows have been, certainly not perfect, but there's been a lot more good than bad. Even the moves that were criticized at the time, Cedric, Pablo Mari, people were very critical of those, and both guys have been serviceable players this year. I think Mari better than serviceable. I think he's actually been quite good. So I'm fine with him getting the summer window. They make some good decisions. I think we could be set up for a little bit more successful year next year than we are right now. The other plus thing he has going for him is right now the bar's pretty low. We're set mid-table, and that's not a hard thing to come up from. You get a different result in 2 or 3 games and you're in a significantly better position. We're a couple red cards away from, being 7th or 8th and at a point where we're not completely out of contention for a European spot in league. We certainly are now, but I expect Arteta to be here at the start of next season. I'm hoping we have a good summer window. And if the January window is any sign, I think there'll be a really big push to get rid of those guys on the outskirts that we've kind of been calling to get rid of. There's no question in January they did a good job of getting rid of a lot of guys we didn't want here. So I think that's going to continue this summer. And just the nature of getting rid of those guys, and we do have some guys out there who we're going to get rid of that will bring a decent value. Maitland-Niles has played okay at West Brom. Joe Willock's been really, really successful at Newcastle. You could argue, I put a tweet up yesterday, and his 4 goals there, he's gained them 8 points this season off of his 4 goals. And right now they're 9 points above relegation. So, that one good decision by them to bring him in on a transfer may have saved their club and their season from relegation. So I think his fee, and I do think we will still sell him this summer, is going up potentially. But I think just by the nature of that and all the guys moving out, that the transfer budget is going to be okay to where we can bring in 2 or 3 guys that, maybe 1, possibly 2 starters and another significant role player. And that, if those decisions are made right on those guys, should be enough to where we're, potentially a top 4 team next year, or certainly right in the mix of getting the top 4 when we get to this part of the season next year. So I think Arteta's still got a lot working in his favor, and I think he feels pretty confident that he's not going anywhere. So I think that almost makes these games for him a little bit easier going into, and then I don't think it's going to have any real impact on his employment.
I just want to pick up on the Joe Willock thing you mentioned, because I wanted to have a kind of a brief point on him. It has really shocked me in a way how many people I've been asking, or rather been saying on Twitter, how much they would say, "Oh, look how good he's doing, let's keep him." And I'm stunned by that, because for so long we have sold so poorly at the club, and we've hung on to players thinking that they might either get a bit of value or they might come good, and then eventually they've gone for absolutely peanuts. And this is the thing, is that we've got an opportunity here to sell a player, in my mind, for 20 million quid, which is the value that's being touted, which I never thought we'd be able to get for him, to be honest, based upon what we saw from him at Arsenal. To a club in Newcastle that aren't going to be a threat to us. I say that now. That aren't going to be a threat to us, he says, praying. And you've got a chance to, again, make a really good profit on this guy. And I feel like he's playing really well at Newcastle because that's kind of where he fits in for me in the Premier League, is that kind of level of a mid. I say mids, they're fighting relegation, but I look at Newcastle as more of a mids Premier League table team, to be honest, in the more general things of when things are more normal. I look at that and I think about it and I go, yeah, that's probably where he suits them. And they've shown that they're willing to spend, Newcastle, in the last year or so. They hadn't previously, but you look at the money they spent on Joe Linton, the money they spent on the other players they brought in, St. Maximin, etc. So they can bring some players in, and they usually bring just one or two of that figure, and he could be one of those, especially if he's really liked by Steve Bruce and they want to keep Steve Bruce. I think that's the perfect time to sell him. Anyway, you may have noticed when Jared was talking that Drew's face dropped considerably, not because of necessarily anything that Jared said, but more so because of some happenstances going on in the chat box regarding the manager and who could be his replacement. Now, I cannot speak any higher of a certain Julian Nagelsmann, to be honest. I think he is an amazing coach. I think that he would be just an amazing person at Arsenal. I think he would be the best option. I think Arsenal should do everything they can, Drew, to go for Julian Nagelsmann. I can see from your face the elation and the agreement that you have with me. And I'd just like you to, again, echo the thoughts that I've just said there.
I needed a moment to come off mute to compose myself. I'm going to kill you for bringing this up. But, like, ironically enough, in the last, let me see, when was it? In the last hour, Jan-Aga Fjorthoff just went on Twitter and was saying that Bayern have contacted Leipzig to speak to Nagelsmann, and that Nagelsmann would potentially be open to going to Bayern. Obviously, if you know Hansi Flick is leaving. So there you have it. Simple as that. For me, the time to get Nagelsmann was before he went to Hoffenheim or right after he left Hoffenheim. It wasn't going to be after he went to Leipzig, especially given the work that he's done and the trajectory of some other clubs. And it'd be a different discussion if Flick wasn't leaving early. The minute that Flick was leaving, Bayern were going to go after Nagelsmann. Whether he wants to go or not, it's entirely up to him, but that's been the ultimate goal. You know, they tried to get him when Pep was on staff to groom him under Pep, and then when Pep left, Nagelsmann would be in place already. For me, I think he's the best German manager available. And there was scope to suggest that if Klopp left Liverpool, say the Super League went ahead and Klopp left Liverpool, then Klopp could have gone to Bayern as an option. Bayern could have looked at that, but I don't think Klopp wants to leave Liverpool, at least not now anyway. So there you have it. That's the level of manager we're discussing. And I think one of my biggest gripes with the fans is that they have to understand that the lens that people view the club with changes depending on who you ask. You know, if I know a lot of fans want Graham Potter as an example, and I'm going to throw this back to you.
Why did you say that?
Now you know how it feels like.
Oh my God! just for a second, how desperate? How desperate are people that they're actually using a guy that won one home game in the whole of 2020 to be Arsenal's coach? How?
Listen,
I'm seeing Eddie Howe suggested in the chat. Eddie Howe. A guy that relegated Bournemouth, we now want as the Arsenal. Okay, sure.
I mean,
great.
Touche, Tom. I know how it feels like, but for me, it's the same thing. Like, if you look at just take the Potter example, he would bite your hand off to come to Arsenal. Are massively ahead of Brighton in every respect of management, but you can't look at the trajectory that Leipzig has taken since they've been introduced into professional football. How they're built, how they're structured, the way that they spend, the way that they do things on the back end, the way that they're very, very quickly becoming one of the predominant challengers to Bayern, the way that they've had considerable European success, if not won a trophy, but they've gone deep in Champions League already. These are things that you have to, and if you stack it up against Arsenal, the only thing you can say is that Arsenal would maybe have more money, or maybe he'll get more wages than he does at Leipzig. But we're not we don't have the pull for other people and players that we would for certain ones. That's kind of one of the things that I talk about when I talk about transfers, is that if you ask an Austrian if they want to go to Arsenal, they don't have some tie at Arsenal. This goes back to the Marcel Sabitzer links that we had. If he could choose between staying at Leipzig and coming to Arsenal, he would stay at Leipzig. Or if he could go to a club where he has maybe a bigger connection to, then he would probably go there. It's just something I wish fans would be a bit more open-minded to. But yeah, for me, I'm not surprised that Bayern are rumored to be interested in Nagelsmann. I don't even think Spurs have a chance at Nagelsmann for very much the same thing. I think the only way that they would, or anybody, if us, it would give him carte blanche on transfers. He's very much the kind of person that needs to build a program and a system on his vision and his vision alone, which is why I kind of even wonder why he would want to go to Bayern, because the whole reason why Flick is leaving is because he's at odds at loggerheads with Bayern brass about how they want to do things moving forward. So if Bayern's not prepared to give him carte blanche in a lot of different respects, that relationship's going to go sour probably pretty quickly. So I don't know. But yeah.
Do you feel better now?
Do you feel better now?
I got my Potter thing out. That was fun. See, it's good. It's good. This is what we do. This is our therapy. That's what it's for. Before we get into your questions, which obviously we spend the last half an hour of these shows answering your questions. So if you have one, get ready, get prepared, because we're entering that period. I wanted to discuss obviously the other thing that happened that day, which was, of course, the protest, which happened outside the stadium. Jared, when do you think, and I asked this, I don't know if people tuned in for our Let's Talk Arsenal show on Friday, but actually Pablo, who I was very, very thankful for being there, managed to actually pass the microphone over to one of the fans that was at the ground so we could interview someone that was there live. It was a really good, I really enjoyed doing it. I thought the listeners really appreciated it too. And I asked them quite a difficult question. I said to them, ultimately, the end goal of this protest is most likely unachievable. That Kroenke is probably not going to go. He's not going to sell. But what then is the point? Why do it? Why protest? What is the ulterior to it? So I'm gonna again similarly challenge you, Jared, to kind of answer this question. Is whilst the protest is certainly something I'm behind and I support it 100%, and Kroenke out all the way. But what is the ulterior? What is the alternative to that end goal that you think the protest can achieve?
Yeah, I don't think, like you said, I'm in agreement. KSE, I don't think is going to sell because they have no reason to sell. You know, all the hashtag Kroenke outs, while I'm not a huge fan of them either, and I would be fine if they sold the team. It's different when you say, you know, manager out, board out, director of football out. Those are all things that can realistically happen due to some fan outrage. Ownership doesn't have to do anything. They're not going anywhere. You can't vote them out. You can't tweet them out. I'm sure KSE probably didn't even spend a minute watching what was going on with the protests. While I still think it's good that fans want to be heard and have the opportunity to be heard, I think one of the great things about living in the areas we live is that we're all free to voice our opinion and go out and do something like that. I think that's great. But it, like you said, it doesn't have any real impact on, you know, our situation. I saw some tweets that people said, you know, we dropped out of the Super League after the fan blowback. And I saw in the apology PR letter that got sent out by KSE that, you know, we hear the fans were listening. We understand this isn't something you wanted, so we removed ourselves. One, I find that a little disingenuous. I don't really buy that to start with. And two, I think there's a really good chance that it's going to come out, you know, down the line that some arrangements were made for some money to go to these big six clubs to stay there, which then the fact, I mean, I already think it's disingenuous, but it will be proven so without a shadow of a doubt once, you know, the figures drop and everybody sees that Arsenal and everybody else got money to not go to the Super League and come back. But I think it's a good outlet for the fans to get their frustrations out. You know, it's about as united as our fan base will ever be on anything. But I don't think it has a real impact on the situation. Like I said, I don't think KSE is going anywhere. And some of the things at the protest, I think, were a little misguided when you hear people say, you know, we have to get rid of KSE because they won't invest in the club. Well, one, if you get new ownership, it may be someone else who's on a self-sustaining model and runs it similarly. And I understand if people would just say, well, yeah, but we'd like them more than KSE. That's fair. We might like them more than KSE. I don't think they're the most likable bunch. But the fact is, it deflects a little bit from the actual problems that we have at Arsenal. Our net spend the last 5 to 7 years is on par or higher than a lot of the other teams that are above us in the table. And that has nothing to do with KSE. That has to do with our executive team, our management, our board, not managing the funds they do have properly. I mean, we could, between us, probably sit here and list off really quickly a dozen decisions they've made that weren't good for the club. either not selling players when their value was high, waiting and selling them for less, letting them go on a free, signing these old guys to $250,000 a week contracts, all of those things. And those are nothing to do with KSE. So while I'm all for the protest, I think it's great to be out, have your voice heard, let people know your opinion. I don't think it's going to do anything to change our fortunes in any real way. I think kind of what we're going to do and what we have done is what we're going to continue to do. And we just have to hope that, people like Edu that are in those positions currently continue to make good decisions, in these off seasons and summers.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that I don't think that they are going to. I don't think they're going to sell. I don't think there's anything necessarily Arsenal fans can do to make that happen. It's going to be down to if a investor comes in with a ridiculous offer, or as David Ornstein put it this morning, a astronomical offer that is going to convince them. Briefly, Drew, obviously the news that dropped also as the protest was going on is that it was spotted, if you saw, by Daniel Ek, who, as I said off the show, I've been desperately trying not to call Daniel EK like a DJ all the time. But Daniel Ek said that he would be willing to throw his hat into the ring. And a good discussion, and Giant Guna spoke about this on Twitter quite a lot as well, and kind of why it's a bit unrealistic, his net worth, and why just because you're worth that amount of money doesn't necessarily mean you could then have that amount of money. You have to sell that share in the company to actually get that money first to reinvest, and that in itself takes ages and you have to find buyers and stuff. But yeah, talk to me about your views about the protest and the prospect of maybe getting a new buyer in.
So I've been pretty vocal about two things. One, the fact that I think fans should protest if they feel the need. Again, because of how much I appreciate how German football operates, fans need to have a voice in the club they support. I think that's paramount. Football is about the fans; it's about the people. So if you take the voice away, then you don't really have football for me. So the protest, for bare minimum, didn't bother me. A few things about the protest did bother me. One, a lot of the xenophobic rhetoric that started to come out from certain sections through the protest, that I have a big problem with. Not all Americans are bad just because we have American owners. So that's the first thing. I wasn't really a fan of that. And second thing, I think if you're going to protest, you need to protest based on facts. People were showing up with banners blaming the Kroenkes and KSE for things that they never did. Blaming the Kroenkes for the club moving to the Emirates, blaming the Kroenkes for changing the badge. Those two things happened years before they were ever involved in Arsenal. So if you're going to go to a protest and you're going to protest against a particular ownership group, then you have to come with your arguments that are focused on that ownership group. Keep it pointed, or else at that point you're doing a disservice to your own protest. If you're making it seem like you just wanted to complain about everything and it doesn't matter who you blame, then why are you protesting in the first place? So those are my two biggest gripes with it. Do I think it's going to matter? No. I mean, you and I talked about that in WhatsApp. General assessment said 5,000 fans showed up to the protest. I think that's a pretty good number to say. I think it was more than 2,000 that some reported. I don't think it was just this massive thing. So say 5,000 fans showed up. 5,000 fans out of a fan base that's somewhere between 30 and 40 million people globally is not going to matter to an ownership group that are the heads of a global sporting entity that is the top 10 or 12 richest football club on the planet. That's valued over $2 billion. Are not going to care about 5,000 disgruntled fans. St. Louis fans, when it was confirmed that the Kroenkes were moving the Rams back to LA, 25,000 people showed up in protest one day. It didn't change a thing. People have to understand that billionaires really only care about the bottom dollar. If you want to get the Kroenkes out, and this is the ironic thing that I tweeted about, I said people are showing up to this protest in droves wearing this season's kit. If you want to protest about ownership, why are you buying the season's? Why are you showing up to a protest about the owners wearing this season's kit? You know what I mean? Like, if you want to get the Kroenkes out, stop giving them your money. And it has to be in droves. But people, at the end of the day, don't want to do what's actually required. They don't want to cancel their season tickets. They don't want to stop going to matches. They don't want to stop buying the kits. And I have a lot of reservations about some certain things about the platform. But recently, DT said this on one of the AFTV shows with him and just Robbie. I forget, maybe All Against Blazing. I think that's what it's called. Yeah. But he said that at the end of the day, we're going to keep buying things. And he said, both you and I, Robbie, are wearing kits that we just gave club money. We're wearing things that give the club money, right? So, of course, the owners aren't going to leave. Are enough people going to actually protest? Are enough people going to stop giving the club money for them to lose enough money to leave? Absolutely not. And then if you look at the finances of it, the Kroenkes have no reason to sell. You know what I mean? Like, they would happily take thousands of fans being unhappy if they keep making money every year. You know, billionaires go where their money is. As long as Arsenal is profitable, as long as Arsenal sits in their portfolio and allows them to do other business ventures to keep making money, they're going to keep Arsenal in their portfolio. That's it. Unless there's something catastrophic happens and they have to sell it, or unless someone gives them the most outrageous bid comes to the table that they can't possibly say no. I mean, like $4 billion. Like, here's $4 billion, give me Arsenal. They would probably take that, but that's twice what the club is valued. Of course you would take that. Anyone would take it. Any smart businessman or woman would take that. But no one's going to do that. So I understand the sentiment that the Ek came with. And he might, on average, probably be a better owner because, you know, he's European. He's grown up with a love of football. So by default, he might have a different aspect and a better appreciation for things like fan voices and maybe fan involvement to a bigger level than maybe what the Kroenkes are used to, because in American sports, in our opinion, it's not matter about franchises because all that matters is the bottom dollar, right? So I appreciate that sentiment, but I don't think it's going to matter. Again, I was just in like an hour-long debate about this on Twitter before the podcast. And Michael and I were talking about just the finances behind everything. You have to make it, something has to happen to make this a no longer a profitable venture to get KSE out. That's it. Or you have to give them such a massive sum of money for them to say, I'm never going to make that much money continuously owning the club, so I may as well take it and run. You know what I mean? Like, that's it. And it's unfortunate. And a lot of people, I kind of feel like, you know, maybe Jack probably agree with this too. I think when you look at both sides of an argument and you sit in the gray area, sometimes you try to see both sides of it, people automatically assume that, like, I've been called a Kroenke supporter more times than I care to count. And and it annoys me. I don't support their ownership. I try to present the argument from their perspective. It doesn't mean I support them. It doesn't mean I want them as owners. Believe me, if Ek came in and said I'd buy the club, I'd rather take a chance on Ek. For sure. You know what I mean? But when you look at it, things logically and without the biased lens, KSE is going to be here unless they don't need to be, or unless they can't afford to be. And that's kind of where I'm at. So by all means, keep protesting. But again, if you're going to keep protesting, and I support that, you have to protest in a way that's going to matter. You know, like someone said, you know, billionaires that have like the portfolio the size of KSE, they're not going to care if the fan base of one asset is annoyed when the fan base of another asset is quite happy. You know, so that's kind of it for me.
Ian Frater in the chat says, I hear a lot of acceptance of the KSE ownership from this panel, but not much regarding solutions. Some of you are too critical of the fan base. Ian, I would suggest scrolling back, listening, because Drew literally just said what you need to do if you want to get the ownership out, which is hurt them in their pocket. Don't buy the kits, don't go to games. I think sometimes what I often experience is blinkered hearing is what I like to.
100%. And it's the same on Twitter. People will read 1/3 of what you tweet and harp on that 1/3, but forget the other 2/3 word that we would have agreed on. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Or they watch a third of a video and leave a comment about that third, not having listened to the other 2/3 where we address exactly what that comment is talking about. Yeah, it's frustrating as hell. But it's just the world we live in, unfortunately. Anyway, we have reached the point of the show where we are going to go through your questions. You can keep asking them in the chat box. We'll try and get through as many as possible. We have got quite a few. I really like this one from Matt G, and I'm going to give us all a chance to answer it, but we're going to be swift with it. Matt G says, if you could ask Arteta one question, what would it be? I'd ask, why do you think the team that has the most possession deserves to win? Which I quite like as a question. I'm going to give you two a little bit of thinking time on this and quickly try and come up with one myself. If I was to ask Arteta a question, I would ask, it's a really tough one. I mean, any of you have one ready to hand, or are you still thinking? I'm really struggling because I feel like you've got to ask a question that ultimately he would be able to answer and that wouldn't just bat away and deflect. It's tough.
It is tough. My question, and it is with every manager, is I would ask, what is your ultimate vision of Arsenal? Like in the ideal world, you could have any player at any position. What style do you want to play? And obviously, I don't mean, I'd sign Messi and De Bruyne and on down the line. But what type of player do you want in each position, and what do you want Arsenal football to look like? What do you want Arteta ball, if you want to call it that, to look like? Because I think when we got him, a lot of people are like, "Oh, this is Pep's guy. We're going to play this tiki-taka, like real free-flowing game." And in reality, I think Arteta is much more defensive-minded than a lot of us, including myself, anticipated when we hired him. So I would just like to hear. We always talk about the team isn't what he wanted. It's unbalanced. He has some guys he wants to shift in. I would just love to know what the ultimate vision is in his mind of what Arsenal could be under him if he had his druthers.
I think I'd ask him, and that's a really good question, Jared. I think I would ask him because it would answer a lot of other people's questions as well that we ask us a lot, is that what is it about you that you think you are the best man for the job over someone who is a more experienced coach? What is it that you are going to be able to do for Arsenal to take us forward from your perspective, which also links into what you were saying, Jared, but specifically, what is it about you that is better for us than hiring someone with greater experience? Drew, have you got a question to mind?
I think it was leaning towards Jared's. I was talking with Elliot at Arsenal Vision about this earlier, and we were kind of discussing about, we're struggling for goals under Arteta. For someone who clearly does understand the tactical side of the game, we have seen improvement in a lot of our attacking players. We're struggling for goals more so than under Emery, more so under Wenger and the waning Wenger years, and we were trying to maybe figure out and discern why that could be. So I guess my question would be more of a tactical one. It's more of, how do you see yourself rectifying that? Because the data is there to show that we've improved on the defensive side of the game immeasurably, but we're struggling for goals now. So my question would be, do you think it's a byproduct because you haven't focused on it yet, or is it because you don't feel you have the players available to play how you actually want to play and what those players might look like? So it's part of that. It's part of what Jared's question was. It's also kind of a tactical one, just kind of how you plan on fixing something that in the Premier League is the currency that matters overall. And if you look at the table, Leeds have surrendered 50 goals this season, but they've scored more than we have, thus they're above us in the table. I think so. And for a club like Arsenal, who I guess a lot of the club legacy is we've had so many good attacking signs over the years. I'm all for being stout at the back. It's important. You need both aspects of it. But in the Premier League, you can't build long-term systems off of having good defense. Sheffield United have proved that. Teams constantly prove that year in, year out. You need to be able to go out and score goals. I think this season would look very different if you added just 10 to 15 goals to our goal tally this season. If you look at the table just based off of that, if you add 15 goals to that, we're at 59 goals. That's what Leicester scored there in third place, and we have a similar defensive record. If you add just 10 goals, we're at 54, which is on par with Spurs, Liverpool, West Ham. We have better defensive numbers than they do, and they're all higher than the table. So clearly the issue now is goals. So I want to know how he's going to fix that. You're muted.
Classic. We'll swiftly now go through as many of these as we can. Daniel Roberts says, do you understand why some people, and I'm glad you used the word people here, would want us to lose the Europa League if it has a chance to get Kroenke out? The simple answer is no. Well, actually, that's a lie. I understand why some people would. But the reason why I said I'm happy to use the word people is because I wouldn't consider those people fans if they want Arsenal to lose. It's as simple as that for me. Jared, Graham Yates says, when will Arsenal join the Super League? And he's basically saying, do you think that if we join the Super League, that is KSE's end game for the club, that extra money?
I think based on what we've seen, it's likely they're in game. They would like there to be a Super League, and they want Arsenal to be in it. I don't want it to happen, but I think it's still kind of not if, but when. The one thing I will say about the attempt recently is that it went down in such a ridiculously catastrophic way that it was kind of an embarrassment, and it just fell apart so quickly. My hope from that is that the next Super League, rather than us talking about it in 3 to 5 years, maybe now we can push it back and make it somewhere in the 5 to 10 year range before we have to talk about it again. But ultimately, if there's a move to a Super League that's going to bring more money, of course, the ownership, they're in it. Arsenal's an investment vehicle for them. They don't care about the football like all of us fans do. It's a business that they own to make money and to grow in net worth. So if they have an opportunity laid in front of them to do that, I don't think they're ever going to say no.
Drew, Yannick Max says, what are your thoughts on Anthony Robinson as a backup option for Tierney in the summer?
I think it'd be a good option, but I always try to look at this angle. I think Yannick always comes up with good players to talk about, but I feel like if his intention is to break into and establish himself as a
Stop swinging, you're making me feel ill.
I do that, I think sometimes. I feel like if Robinson's end game for himself is to establish himself as a first choice option moving forward for the U.S. men's national team, he's not going to want to come to Arsenal to be a backup. I think that's it. From his standpoint, it makes more sense to start somewhere else, to go to another team who maybe might need a left back where he's going to play 8 to 9% of the time. But I think from a personnel building standpoint from our end, I think he does make sense. But I can't just look at it from a singular point of view. You know, I feel like he'd be better off at a mid-table Premier League side that he's starting we can make out. He'll easily get into the men's national team based off of that. He doesn't need to be at a top 6 Premier League club to do that. You know, so as an option, I like it, but I just don't think it would make sense for him. And if we did get him, I wouldn't be sad about it though.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think that Arsenal should either be targeting someone very young, like 20 under, or someone like a Van Aanholt or a Bertrand that's contract's running out, and you just get them as backup. Let's get another question. MIL Reaction says, Jared, should the fans have shares in the club like the German clubs do?
I would love it. I would love it if the fans felt like they had a voice. I think sort of the fan culture in English football is so much different than it is here in the States, and kind of the expectations. I would love it if the Premier League said fans were going to own 51%. I think that would go a long way towards keeping fans happy, keeping all these protests from needing to happen. So I'd be all for it. Do I think it's going to happen? My best guess would be no. I don't see it coming into play, but if it did, I would be all for it.
Yeah, there are difficulties with the 50-1 and implementing it into English football. If you want to know more about the 50-1, Rafa Honigstein did a really, really good explanation the other day. I feel like Drew wants to come in on this very briefly. Go on, Sam.
Briefly, so a few things that people don't understand. 50+1 does not mean fans get to decide how a club spends its transfer money. I'm putting it out there now because I think a lot of fans feel like if they had a voice, it means
you're telling me it's not like FIFA. Is that what you're saying?
No, that's exactly what it's not like. So I feel like a lot of fans feel like 50+1 means that fans get to decide big issues like that. They don't. It just means that it stops people coming in and getting majority ownership of a team. However, what they don't understand is if an owner is there long enough, I think it's 20 or 25 years, they then can get full ownership of a club. They have to be there long enough, and then they can come in and move past the 49.9% or whatever the damn math is. You know what I mean? So that's the caveat. I do think that fans need to have, again, I think fans need to have a voice. I think fans should have some ownership stake in their team. I don't think it should be 50+1. I feel like the other thing that, maybe this is a podcast in itself, but if you were to do 50+1 in the Premier League, there would be the scope for the league to lose so much money because no billionaire owner is going to want to surrender 50+1% of their ownership in a team. They would back out immediately. You would get something that's much, much closer to the Bundesliga. And then you run the risk of clubs not being able to afford higher transfer fees, higher wage packets. You might lose TV revenue because it's no longer the star-studded, action-packed, all the big names come here anymore because clubs would be able to afford it over time. So that's the drawback. Is if you want all that kind of level of fan involvement, then you're going to have to be fine with the fact that the Premier League loses so much of its financial punching power and pull that you might have a very different looking Premier League not that long after it. So that's all I would say.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. I think that, as I say, if you want to learn like in absolute detail, Rafa Honigstein's made a really good video on it. But Drew says there, it's people need to understand what it does mean and what it doesn't mean because people are just assuming, oh, it's fans in control, and that's not what it exactly means. Josh Hunter says, I believe this may be directed towards me. It says, why is Potter a bad shout as manager when the board turned down a proven manager in Ancelotti? for Arteta for financial reasons. Josh, to answer your question, I will do it as sincerely and without sounding as patronising as possible. The reason why I don't want Graham Potter is that I don't think, and I should caveat this by saying that it's not me saying that a manager of a club in that area of the table cannot one day become a manager of the club at the size of Arsenal. I think if they prove themselves, they certainly can be. It's not me underestimating them. It's not me necessarily disregarding them. It's me analysing what they've done. I actually think that where Brighton are in the table is lower where they should be in comparison to the team that they have. I think that Brighton have got some really good players, and he is not actually getting the best from that side. So if he's not getting more from that Brighton team that includes some really decent players, I think that you can turn around and effectively say that he's not going to be able to do it at an even higher level. That's why I don't want Potter. In regards to your question on Ancelotti, at the time, with the benefit of hindsight, it's very easy for me, and I agree with the point in saying that Arsenal probably should have hired maybe someone else in comparison to Arteta. When we look at where we are now and we look at where the season has gone, I think there is a really strong argument for that. I don't think we turned down Ancelotti unless what you're saying is that by Arsenal not actually approaching Ancelotti, that in itself is turning him down as an option, which is fair enough. Maybe Ancelotti would have been a good manager for us in the short term, but I think you look at Arsenal, Arsenal's a long-term project club right now. I'm not saying in terms of staying as long as Arsene Wenger did, but with the job that is on hand at this club, with how long it's going to take to turn things around, we don't need a manager, in my view, that's just for the short term. We need someone that is going to change things across the next 4 to 5 seasons. If it's not Arteta, I feel like we'll know that throughout next season. But right now, I need to see another window before that actually happens. So I hope that answers your question in regards to Potter and why I personally wouldn't want him. Let's scroll down. Spiral Sam actually says about this relating to what we just said there. Drew, I think this is for you. Why did Mikel get the job and what were the overall reasons? Mikel was second choice to Emery, so why should we settle for second best? I don't know the question about context. I feel.
I feel like my take on that is I think Josh Kroenke wanted Arteta, but I think he maybe deferred to the decision making of he who shall not be named at the time.
Yeah, we don't use that name.
Right. So I feel like that's what, and I feel like with how quickly we immediately wanted to bring Arteta in shows, I think maybe Josh stepped in and made an executive decision. And because he's de facto head of the club, he can do that if he really wanted to, I suppose. So I feel like that's how that came off. Why he got the job is, I think for me, I know Jared could probably reference some other things as well, as if you look at KSC style of ownership, it is, as you say, long term. They look at where we're going to be in 4, 5, and 6 years, and they prefer to do that with bringing a younger manager or coach in and growing over time. And you've seen that with the Denver Nuggets, with the Colorado Avalanche, with the Rams. So I feel like if they're following a model that for them has worked, and if you look at the last 3 seasons, all 3 of those franchises have all been considerably better than the past 4 years before that. There was uptick in all 3. I think you'll know why Arteta got the job. And also he was available. Yes, and I think also the club, because it runs sustainably, doesn't want to have to shell out an exorbitant amount of money to buy a coach out of his contract early, manager out of his contract early. I don't think anyone really wants to do that unless they can really afford to do it. So I just think for me, they wanted someone who was younger, charismatic, personable, understood the tactical side of the game, and who they thought they could grow with. I think for me, that's it for me.
Yeah,
Jared,
on that yeah, and like Drew said, this is something that isn't new for the Kroenkes. The one that always stood out for me was just a couple of years prior to Arteta being signed. The Los Angeles Rams had a coaching vacancy, and there's a lot of seasoned veteran coaches available. They opted for Sean McVay, who at the time was zero head coaching experience, had only been an assistant, but was thought to be really tactically astute in the NFL game. So they brought him in and gave him a chance. And I believe his second year there, the Rams actually made it to the Super Bowl. So they've come down a bit since then. But, like we all have the recency bias, they literally just did the same thing and had it work very well for them in the NFL. So I think that kind of was in their mind too, that they thought they could do the same thing in the Premier League.
Yeah. Staying with Jared, Ollie Yemi says, how long is the process and what does the end of the process look like for Arsenal?
So I think this coming year will kind of be the deciding factor. We talked about it a bunch on here. I'm good with Arteta being our coach going into next season. I think we've made improvements in some areas we really needed it, specifically on the defensive side. And I've not seen enough yet that I dislike to say that we couldn't succeed with him as the manager. So with that in mind, I'm totally fine with him going into next season, but I think that will sort of be the make or break for him. If we have a summer where we bring in a couple of players and then we go out and finish 10th, 11th, 12th next year, I think that's probably going to be the end for him. But keep in mind right now, we're still playing European football this year. If we get a good result against Villarreal, which, maybe we will, maybe we won't. But if we beat them and we're playing in a final, very likely against United, while they've had a much better season than us, there's no question about that. The one thing I will say, of any good team we could have to play in a final, if there's one team Mikel Arteta has had very good results against in his time here, it's United. We've played them 3 times. He's yet to lose, and we've yet to concede a goal. So if you have to play a good team in the final, that would be probably the best case scenario for us. And I mean, think about last year at the end of the season. We did not play well, but we won the FA Cup. And people were very positive about Arteta going into this year. So if we turn around, win Europa League, get Champions League football, I think the talk of Arteta come June 1st is going to sound a whole lot different than it does right now.
Yeah. Yo, I mean, following on from that question, Yo says, what have you seen since Arteta's promotion to make you believe he will do better with greater money and time? Just to tackle this quickly, and I'm going to give Drew a chance to answer this as well. In my mind, the reason why I'm okay is one, I mean, the bottom line is that there's a trophy in there, which I know some people just disregard like it's nothing. It's really, really not. Ask a Spurs fan how much they'd love to win a trophy.
Ask him today.
I can tell you it was quite a lot. Yes, very apt, considering what that is. But it's more so, in part, it's about actually what he's done with the money in comparison to the previous seasons, in conjunction with Edu, in bringing in identifying 2 areas that needed really decent upgrades, and we did that with Partey and we did that with Gabriel. I also think that if you separate the 2 halves of the season, the first half of the season was absolutely awful. It's the reason why we are where we are right now, is because of that awful first kind of third to a half of the season. And actually in the second half of the season, why I think that the differences between our wins and our losses or draws has actually been, the losses and draws have been very, very fine margins. Only in that Liverpool game in this second half of the season did I genuinely feel like we were absolutely smashed. Manchester City arguably could have smashed us if they'd have got out of second gear, but they didn't need to. But it's those 2 games I kind of really look at. But this second half of the season, like winning away at Leicester, first time we've won against a top 3 side in the Premier League at this point in the season since 2015 with that Man City game, obviously. Beating Spurs at home in that performance, beating Chelsea on Boxing Day. There's been some really huge performances. We've blitzed teams, which showed me the potential this side have, like Slavia Prague, like West Brom. Winning at Brighton, which was a really difficult fixture as well for us over history as well, has shown that, in my mind, this second half of the season has been so much better than the first. It's not been amazing, don't get me wrong, and there's been some really big things that have gone wrong. But I look at the season and I go, I can just kind of compartmentalize this season and go into next season knowing that he's got a good track record of spending in the summer and how we approach the January window as well. I look at the momentum that we could pick up from how we've played in the second half of the season. If we can tweak the team by moving out some of the consistent mistake makers that we've got and bring in some really consistent quality players in the summer, I do feel like we can go on from here. But I won't know that until this summer happens, and I'm not willing to chuck it in right now at a risk, basically, of losing that. Drew, what do you? I wanted to give you an opportunity to answer it. So, how do you feel? Anything extra to what I've said there, or do you disagree in a sense?
I think one thing extra I would add is we have to look at Edu in this as well. Still, it's all well and good to say, like, if we spend and Arteta gets players, and as Jared said, if he doesn't then perform, then the writing could be on the wall. But what happens if Arteta doesn't get the investment that maybe he needs, this summer? What happens if Edu invests or puts us on a transfer spending cost this summer that just brings players that, again, don't make the grade? If we don't spend the money wisely, again, it's easy to blame Arteta, but I think it's clear that to everybody that we need to improve in certain areas, not just how we buy, but how we sell. And I think a big test of the brass this summer is going to be how they handle certain players. Like, are we going to persist on keeping hold of the likes of Nketiah and Nelson and Maitland-Niles if they don't have a place in the squad moving forward. You have to sell, and you have to sell well. If you do that, that's going to help you to get the players in that some of us or a lot of us think we need. So I would add that, but I agree with everything else. I feel like I could probably be a lot more angry this season. I would be if we didn't see the improvement post Boxing Day. I'd probably be livid, to be honest with you. And if that form persisted, we would be in the bottom quarter of the table, 13th, 14th, 15th, if we didn't get that uptick in form. But post Christmas, what are we, top 4, top 5 in the league? So it's not what all fans want, which is they want us to win the league. But it does show that when things settle down and we got some players available to us, the improvement was there, which is what you want to see from the manager. So, like you said, compartmentalize it. I'm happy with how second half of the season has gone, but I want to see that move into next season. And for me, I think that none of this discussion happens if we win Europa League and get Champions League next season. Everyone's just going to stop complaining if they see us in Europe. They'll just start complaining when we get smashed every week, but that's besides the point. So it is what it is. But but at the very least, getting Champions League would open us up to more money to be invested, which is the key for me. And then how we use that money is the even bigger key. So it's one step at a time. Hopefully we win the Europa League and take it from there. But if we don't, I still think there's enough scope and room for us to improve next season just based off what we've seen since Christmas. So.
Yeah, spot on. And that is where we are going to round off today's show. Thank you ever so much, everyone in the chat box, for tuning in this evening. Make sure you drop a like on the video and subscribe if you're new. I'd just like to give a massive thank you to my panel. First of all, Jared, as is becoming a theme at the end of our videos, your lighting just drops off. I don't know why. I don't know what happens.
I thought you were closing the curtain on me. It was time to go.
Oh, dear me. But thank you so much, Jared. I really appreciate your time this evening, and thanks for jumping in.
Yeah, always a pleasure. Loved a chance to get back on and chat with you and Drew. It's been great.
You can follow Jared on Twitter at JC_AFC at Chicago Gooner. You can find him on there, as well as lots of other platforms where he does plenty of other podcasting stuff too. And you can find him in the Discord server because he is one of our excellent TGT ambassadors, as well as our expert members who can join our Discord server too. Drew, always a pleasure, mate. I mean, I feel like this is good. We managed to get some of our Potter/Nagelsmann hatred out today. It was a good therapy session, though.
It was good. Thank you for having me as always. So, it was a good discussion. It was good to finally get to talk to Jared on an actual podcast instead of just the ample tweeting we do back and forth on certain topics. So, and thanks for everyone in the chat as usual, even though some of you decided to do nonsense things. So 99% of the time. Good, so,
nonsense. Hashtag nonsense things in the chat. That's perfect. That's great. Thank you so much, people. It's been an absolute pleasure as always. We'll be back tomorrow. We're going to be interviewing a podcast favorite. I know you guys really appreciate when we interview this guy, Alvaro Romeo, who is the Spanish correspondent for TalkSport. We're going to be talking to him about Villarreal and Unai Emery. So make sure you tune in for that one to get all clued up on what has happened to our ex since he left and moved off back to Spain. We'll be back then tomorrow. We'll see you again very, very soon. It's been a pleasure to speak to you as always. And as always, up the Arsenal.